Hi, this is Scott. I want to take a brief minute to let everyone know that starting the first week of January, Imaginarium will have its own feed on iTunes, and not grouped in with the Supernaut shows. What this means is you can search in iTunes for Imaginarium, and only our show will pop up. And the same thing goes for the links on the show page. And now, time for the Imaginarium.
This is a presentation from the Supernaut Network.
Welcome to the Imaginarium, the show where art and passions for creativity intersect and combine for a conversation that can only be found in the Imaginarium. I'm your host, Scott Colbert. This week's guest is the co-host of the Midside Podcast, creator, writer, and executive producer of the upcoming web series How to Survive a Zombie Apocalypse, Justin Lesniewski. And welcome to Imaginarium, Justin.
Thanks. It's great to be here. I appreciate you having me here in the Imaginarium. I think I see Gene Wilder over in the corner singing a song we might all know.
And that's exactly how I end the show, too, with pure imagination.
That's how we should begin and end all endeavors.
Absolutely. Well, that and Terry Gilliam's Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus, that's actually where the title came from.
Ah, very cool, very cool.
And I just love that word. So anyway, you've been on the Supernauts podcast, but for those who may not have heard that, why don't you give us a little bit of your background?
My background is basically that I'm a writer. I'm from the East Coast, and I grew up reading. I was a voracious reader, and I've just always wanted to be a writer. I did my undergrad education for writing. I did my master's in professional communication. I've done some teaching. I've done some production work for a nonprofit. I've done some production work on set. And right now I'm, as you said, podcasting and trying to launch my own web series. So it's a bit of an everyman, jack of all trades experience, but the main focus has always been around writing and improving my abilities as a writer.
Well, let's go into that a minute, because I know you have some very definite ideas about writing. And how do you approach a project that you're writing? How do you start it, and what are your goals, and how do you go through the process?
Well, all writing for me starts with observation. I've always been super observant. I always will be. I'm a big people watcher. I was known in undergrad for sitting in the campus center between classes and just watching everyone go by, because that's such a heavy traffic time. Everyone would just be there at the same time. I love going to places like Las Vegas because there's just so many people there, and they're sort of more relaxed in a place like Las Vegas, so you can really see what they're about. And I just observe the world, and I see the way people are. That's why the Midside Podcast is Witness the Farce, the key word being witness there. Because it's just all about seeing the way things are and then inducing, because induction is the process of going from a bunch of concretes and getting an abstract principle out of it, inducing some sort of character type or some sort of premise of a story or some sort of theme for a story. And then once I have something like that, I think of, what are all the other logical elements that would make that story interesting? And I put them all together in that way.
And who are some of the writers that you look up to?
Writers that I look up to. Okay, well, I actually, because I want to be a television showrunner, I look more towards television for that. So recently, I've really been enjoying Carlton Cuse. I've really been enjoying Bates Motel, The Strain. And I think if you look at everything that was good about Lost, you can more attribute that to him than you can to Damon Lindelof. I'm a big Brian Fuller fan. I'm a big Manny Coto fan. Manny Coto, if that's a little obscure of a name, that's the guy who basically saved Enterprise seasons 3 and 4. He had a short-lived show on Showtime called Odyssey 5. And he also worked on Dexter a bit. And he's worked on 24 a bunch as well. And when he was added on to 24 in the later seasons, that's when they went more into who is Jack Bauer as a character. So when I talk about, making sure everything's integrated, and if I come up with a character, it has to fit with the theme and fit with the premise. Manny Koto does that. He figures out how it all works together and explains it, and that's why I really admire his stuff. And then, of course, directorially, everyone knows my love for Zack Snyder. I think if you look at 300, you look at Sucker Punch. I know it's probably unpopular to say, but we'll get to that in our podcast soon. You look at Man of Steel, you see the ideas that he has in there, and they're very well integrated with the characters and the plot. And then just my favorite writer ever is Ayn Rand.
And we talked a bit about Ayn Rand on the other show. And
Right.
You also had, and I knew this was going to happen as soon as I wanted to mention his name, Moffat, Stephen Moffat.
Oh, yes. It's always tough for me when I'm put on the spot and people are like, well, who are your favorites?
Yeah.
Because I've got so much in my head that when they say it at the moment, I can't come up with it. That's why I made the list on the website. But yeah, I love Moffat. I've loved Moffat since I saw Coupling when I was an undergrad. My friends were like, "Oh, you have to watch Coupling." The thing that Moffat does is his overall construction of his writing, his stories, is tremendous. Everything has a purpose, and everything comes together in the end. I know that's a common critique people have of Doctor Who, that it doesn't come together. But if you watch what he's doing, it does. It's very intricate. If you don't pay attention to everything, you miss very, very subtle things. And I think if you compare his writing to Russell T Davies, Davies left a lot of things open, or he relied on Deus Ex Machina a lot, where it would just be like in the 2-part season finales, the Doctor would always get into some crazy problem, and then it would just be resolved by something that just came out of nowhere and wasn't set up earlier. The biggest instance I can think of is when you had the Dobby Doctor, where he looked like the elf from Harry Potter, and then all people had to do was believe in him, and he was suddenly the Doctor again. That was never set up through the season. Like, if there had been a theme of the importance of the Doctor believing in him, having people believe in him, then it would have been fine. And that's what Moffat does. He sets that up very well. So, yeah, I've loved everything he's done. Jekyll, Coupling, Sherlock. People adore Sherlock. He finally won an Emmy for Sherlock. I was very happy about that. Doctor Who. So any of that, check out anything Moffat's done. It's tremendous.
Now, did you see the most recent season of Doctor Who with the new Doctor?
Yeah, this last season, I think, was his least integrated. And he came out and he said beforehand he was going to try and do it that way. And it did come across more Russell T Davies than it did Moffat. And it's been my least favorite season of Who, my least favorite Moffat season of Who.
There were a lot of shows in it that I liked a lot. But I think by and large it was a fairly weak season. And I was kind of disappointed in it because I thought Peter Capaldi is a fantastic Doctor. I like him a lot. And I really wish that Moffat had kind of risen to the occasion and given Capaldi some really fantastic stories. Well, maybe next season that'll happen.
Yeah, we'll see now that they've established him. He's a great actor. He did a really good job. Jenna Louis Coleman did a really good job as Clara. So it was enjoyable in that sense. And like you said, there were some really, really good episodes. But the overall theme of am I a bad person or not could have been done better on a weekly basis. Likewise, the whole theme of Clara becoming independent and not needing the Doctor to make decisions anymore could have been done better. But as I said, I think that he was intentionally trying to try that because of all the critiques where people have said that his stories were too integrated and were trying too hard to be clever. So I think he was trying to go to the other extreme to maybe satisfy some of his critics or improve his writing. And ultimately, I don't think it worked, and hopefully he'll go back to what I've known and loved him for.
Yeah, and there's always the Christmas special coming up in a couple of weeks to see how he ties everything up, or if he does, and if even Clara stays on the show, because that's still kind of...
Yeah, that's a big rumor that she's going to leave. So it may have also been that, the transition period is always tough between Doctors.
It is, and but even with the weak shows, there's something about that show I enjoy. I become a 12-year-old again watching it.
Yeah, and that's the other thing about Moffat that I really love. If you look at Coupling, you look at Jekyll, you look at Sherlock, you look at Doctor Who, what Moffat said is, to him, intelligence is a superpower. And I absolutely love that somebody has a show and has writing that's just about celebrating the intelligence of humanity. So often people make things that are about, the negative side of people, people's weaknesses, what happens when people do dumb things. But Moffat always celebrates people who are intelligent and seeing them be intelligent. And that's part of what I love about his writing. It's really inspiring to me to see that. Whereas a lot of other stuff I see and it makes me not want to write as much. When I watch something Moffat does, it makes me want to go out there and write.
Exactly. Going off to Ayn Rand for just a moment, I'm assuming you're excited about her new book coming out next year.
Oh, it's called Ideal, I believe, which is actually kind of funny because I did that blog post called Real or Ideal where I quoted her a bunch. Yeah, I mean, it's cool. They've done stuff with that before. It's just sort of, the Ayn Rand Institute always repackages her stuff in new collected volumes with new forewords and essays by people who knew her at the time. So it'll be interesting to read, but I pretty much know all that stuff already. I don't get so excited about the hype around Ayn Rand. I really like the way she approaches writing. And I think, if you divorce it from her philosophy for a second, and I don't mean that you can divorce it from her epistemology or her ethics, all of that applies. That's where she gets her principles of aesthetics from, her principles of art from. So I'm not saying divorce it from objectivism, but I'm saying ignore for a second all the controversy around her. If you just look at her as an artist and a thinker about how to write and how to construct art, and you read The Art of Fiction, The Art of Nonfiction, you read the Romantic Manifesto, just the pure brilliance in there about how to be a writer and how to be an artist and understanding it and actually taking control of it. Because something you hear so often is when you ask someone how they write, they just say, oh, well, it just comes out. I can't explain how I do it. It just happens. I get writer's block sometimes, and then other times it just flows. It just comes out. And she really encourages people to take control and be aware of what they're doing and say, this is why I'm doing it. And, maybe you're not always conscious 100% of everything. Like, I certainly write things sometimes and I go back to it and I go, oh, there's a connection I didn't realize I was making. But if I'm aware of the overall picture that I'm trying to paint metaphorically, it makes it a lot easier for my mind to make those connections. Whereas, at least this is the way I was taught when I was young. It was always, well, the writer didn't intentionally make all those connections. So that's the reader making those connections and not the writer, not the artist. And that's what I really admire about her, much more than her philosophy and her politics. Especially, as I get older, I'm much less politically driven. And, I do agree with her philosophy, but I always came to her first as a writer, as an artist. And that's really what I admire her as. And that's really how she's had influence on me. Less so making me want to change the way I act on a personal level, more so encouraging me to take control of my writing and really be aware of what I'm doing and confident that I can be aware of what I'm doing and that I should make sure everything is working together.
So I'm going to assume that you're an outliner when you write. And that
yes, I am a meticulous outliner. If you want to talk about how to survive the zombie apocalypse, I've only written I've written 3 episodes. I've written the first, the second, and the 10th. But when we went into production, the reason I had those 3 episodes written is based on the locations we picked for the first episode. I also knew that we would be returning there for episode 10 because of the outline I had written. So I went ahead, episode 10 and 2, we would be returning there. So I went ahead and I wrote all of episode 2 and episode 10 so we could shoot the scenes from episode 2 and episode 10 for those locations so we wouldn't have to then pay for them again. But I could only do that because of the outlines I had written. And that sort of goes back to your question about process before. I always know what the beginning point is and what the end point is. So when I came up with this idea, it was originally as a screenplay. And I knew the first scene and I knew the last scene. And the first scene remained. It's the first scene of the web series. I mean, there wasn't as much. I had more of an establishing shot in my head that we just didn't have the budget for. It was an exterior establishing shot of like the entire town, but you just don't have that kind of budget for a web series. But the first scene between the father and the son, between Norm and Dr. Ellman, that was in my head initially. And now I also know what the last scene of the series is going to be that hopefully, ideally, we'll get to shoot one day. And that's how I can pace everything out. Because I can say, well, what's the journey all the characters need to get to go on? What are the things they need to learn in order to get to that final point? Rather than just, this is one of the critiques of Lost was they went off in all sorts of directions because they were trying to buy time. And I think that happens a lot because people don't have an idea of where they're trying to end up for the characters, for the ideas, for all of the integrated elements. One of the influences we haven't mentioned at all is Joss Whedon. And I think if you're going to talk about what his strength is, that's his strength, where he knows where his characters are going to end up and he knows what they have to learn to get there. So his journeys for his characters come across so real and they resonate with people emotionally because he knows how to portray it, how to show it. And yeah, that's why I'm a meticulous outliner, because if I want what I'm doing to make sense, I have to know the beginning and the end before I can get people there.
You said it started out as a screenplay. How did it go from screenplay to a web series?
That was more of a practical thing where I've learned a lot since my time moving out to LA. I moved out here in 2010, and I'll always, unless I somehow make it big on my own, which I don't think the odds of that are, that's a lot of luck based, but I'll always work on other productions. But I learned that if you're going to have what you want to make made, then you have to do it yourself. So I looked at what I had for the outline. I had the 3 acts outlined and I had all the characters I wanted and everything. And I cut it down and I said, well, I'm going to make a web series and I'm going to do my best to make it happen. And this is a really good idea. So how can I pare this idea down? How can I cut it down so that it'll work in that medium and still be successful? And I think I've done that. I think I've cut that down enough to achieve that goal and do something I want on my own and make my vision happen.
And why zombies? At this point, I would think that people are really kind of zombied out. And what's going to be new about zombies in your show that we haven't seen before? Or that, of course you may not want to give that away, but is there something unique about it that we haven't seen?
It's a great question, and to a certain extent you're right. That's a spoiler that will be revealed in episode 10. But the best way to answer that question is to say there will be something new, and it's an evolution of the zombie concept. And the best way I can answer that is to talk about why zombies. I think that a lot of what makes the zombie so compelling as a monster is it has been lost. It's sort of been lost, and even with what Romero has done with it, where I really disliked Land of the Dead, where he tried to insinuate, he didn't really insinuate, it was kind of flatly there, that a zombie life is as valuable as a human life. And then if you look at The Walking Dead, it's no longer about fighting the zombies, it's about fighting the other humans. So I think what makes a zombie movie compelling has been lost, and that's what I'm trying to bring back into it, where zombies are the antithesis of humans. They're unthinking monsters that just act based upon their immediate desires. And zombie movies should ideally be about discovering what humanity is in the face of that. When you're faced with something that isn't you, you have to figure out what you are. You have to define yourself by that opposition. Very rarely do we get that opportunity, or very rarely do we take that opportunity when we realize it's there. So if you look at early Romero stuff, he does that more so. He goes in sort of a direction I don't necessarily agree with politically or socially, but he does that. And there, some of the stuff has that. But nowadays, when you look at something like The Walking Dead, which is all about just fighting other humans, and Z Nation, which is just about, being campy and B-movie, it's all sort of lost. So I agree with you. There's sort of an abundance of this type of story out there, but I don't think there's an abundance of what the story can be. And in today's day and age, with the amount of content that's out there, there's going to be too much of anything. So if something I have is an idea that I think is good, I'm going to do it and believe that an audience is going to flock to what's good. They're going to respond to what's good, regardless of if it's, if there's a lot of zombie stuff out there already. Plus, AMC clearly doesn't think the market's oversaturated if they're doing a Walking Dead spinoff. The Walking Dead comic's still going strong. The Walking Dead's ratings keep going up. So I think there's still a market there. But to me, the market is secondary to the story. The market is only there to make it so I can continue to tell the story I want to tell.
All right, and there's also Brian Keene, the writer, has written a lot of zombie novels, and they're kind of at the top of the mountain right now. And let's see. So let's go over to your podcast, the Midside. When did that start, and what was the genesis for that?
Well, there are kind of two phases of it. There was an initial, we call it a lost season at this point. We call this season 2, what we're doing right now, because we did about 10 episodes a while ago where it was about, hold on a second. Yeah, we did about 10 seconds a while ago. I don't remember when it was. I'm blanking on. I think it was about 6 months before we, sort of did the reboot and then got on to talk back now Pulp Epic. I'm having a brain fart on the timeline. But the genesis of it was I was heavily involved in the Survivor fan community for a while, and like everyone in that has a podcast. I mean, one of the guys who's on the show, Rob Sesternino, has a podcast. It's called Rob Has a Podcast. And he has a lot of people who listen to that. And then like all the fans have a podcast. And it started to be that I was making the rounds on those podcasts. People were asking me to be on it because I do a lot of story analysis, because the editing on that used to be top-notch storytelling. It's kind of gone down in the last couple of seasons. But I was doing those and I was listening to those, and I was just sort of dissatisfied with the way things were being approached from them. And then Penn Jillette, one of my greatest inspirations and heroes, he has his own podcast, but his podcast is more just him talking a lot. And then, of course, if you've listened to the show, you know that Daniel is a big fan of the Adam Carolla podcast, which I don't know if it still is, because I think it was replaced by Serial. I think that podcast is now the number one. But Adam Carolla's podcast was number one for a while. So it was just really comes from listening to that a lot and listening to all the podcasts and saying, hey, this is pretty interesting. It's a way to get your perspective out there and to talk about what's interesting in that regard. But also, I've taught a bunch. I've taught college. I tutor now. So I've learned that I'm very good at speaking to people and speaking my mind. And the more educated I've become, people have told me I'm very well spoken. So I thought, why not put those skills to use and put all my knowledge to use? It's kind of tough every day. I don't talk to a lot of people because a lot of people say things that it could start a huge discussion, but most people don't want to get into huge discussions, just mainly because, one, it's not practical, and two, most people just want to do what they want to do and get out. So it's also a method of expression. And then I think the final reason it was done was I created the midside.com and I said, I just want to have a way for people to know what I stand for and what I'm about and what they're going to get from the things I create. And if I have a podcast and they listen to it, they can get an idea of, okay, that's what Justin's about. That's what the Midside's about. So all of these sort of this confluence of events made it so I created the podcast.
Is there something specific that you try to get across, whether it's through your writing or through the podcast, that you want people to understand? Not necessarily about you, but maybe just, in general.
Yeah, I would say in general, my writing, and this is even in what I enjoy, is about just taking control of your own life and believing you can succeed and you can improve yourself and get over whatever you're dealing with. And I know that sounds sort of simple to say it, but even though I've never suffered a lot and I've never been through really bad things, my parents are great. They've provided me for what I've needed in my life. They gave me a great education. I had a stable house growing up, but it always just felt like that was my place in life. Like whoever I was, that's who I was, and that was going to be the end of it. And I couldn't get out of that, and I couldn't be whatever I wanted. I mean, in my high school, I was never known as the writer. I was actually known as the wrestler in my high school. I was the captain of the wrestling team, won my league a couple years, went to New England's. And there were these two girls in my school that they were known as writers, and they were raised up as the writers. And that was just an example of just all the messages I was hearing from, even my family to the culture at large, my school, of this is who you are, that's your identity, that's the end of it. You're just always going to be the way you are for the rest of your life. And that's why I love stories. I love stories like House. I love Sawyer and Lost. I love Jack Sparrow in Pirates of the Caribbean, because it's all about characters playing on the idea of you can be who you want to be, and playing up with people's expectations of themselves, and struggling with the idea of overcoming who they're seen to be and what they've been through. So I'd say that's my overarching message is, take control of your life, enjoy your own life. There's so much out there that's saying not to enjoy your own life. Enjoy your own life and just love yourself, love life, and become the best version of you that you can become, and be happy with that.
It's very much to thine own self be true philosophy.
Yeah, it's very much so. And that's where you sort of see the influence of Ayn Rand as well, where when I read her work, it wasn't like a lot of people experience sort of this upheaval where their whole life has changed. And that's where you get a lot of these people who are like sort of super intense about it. And they're like very, very rabid, like Ayn Rand is the king of everything, and I agree with everything she's ever said. And they sort of give over their own identity to her, and to her belief system. And that's psychologically complex, and I'm sort of simplifying it. So just to be clear, I understand there's more psychological complexity to it, but I'm only creating that concept to contrast it with myself, where I read it and I was like, oh yeah, this makes sense. This is a lot of what I've been trying to say in my life. And that's where I found all of her artistic stuff as well. And, when I read The Art of Fiction, I was like, oh yeah, this is a lot of the way I approach it as well. It's refining it. It's making me look at it on a more detailed level, because she's very much about individualism. She's very much about using your own mind, and she's very much about loving your life and, being true to yourself.
I think a lot of it with her is not all, but most people tend to discover her at a fairly young age. And when I say that, I would say maybe teens to 20s. And that seems to be a prime time where we have this kind of naive idealism about life, where things seem to be black and white, which is certainly what, if you read her, she has a very black and white view on a lot of things. There's not a lot of gray in her opinions. And I mention that because I thought it was interesting that you had said that the older you get, the less political interest you have. And I see that with people who sometimes read her, is that the older they get, they don't quite have the enthusiasm for her work that they used to.
Oh, well, I certainly have the enthusiasm for her work. I didn't mean to say that. I just meant like I was big into politics in undergrad, in that, I thought it was a big battle that had to be fought. Who wins the next election is going to determine the future of the world for blah, blah, blah. That's what I meant, that I'm less politically inclined. Like, I don't read these news stories anymore and get caught up in the cycle of everything is the biggest thing ever and it's all controversy. And, I don't get involved with everyone has to post about Ferguson on Facebook, because posting your opinion about Ferguson on Facebook is going to make a huge difference. I think what you're talking about with Ayn Rand is certainly a critique I've had of the way a lot of people apply it. And it was very frustrating for me. Is something I've learned a lot about that's actually helped my writing, and I teach it all the time now, is the word context. And yeah, Ayn Rand writes about when you have an opinion and you believe it's correct, stick to it. But what so many people miss is sticking to your opinion doesn't mean stick to your opinion in every context. Truth comes from context. It comes from the facts of reality met with context. So something may be true at one point and it's not true at another point. So yeah, trust your mind. Believe in your mind in the context when you make that conclusion, but understand that it can change, and be open to observation and open to learning new things about the world that can show you that, well, it's not quite as simple as saying that is wrong. a perfect example is sexual morality, right? People will say, well, one night stands make you a bad person. There are times when you could see why someone might value a one night stand and somebody else might value a one night stand. And those two people could come together, and for them, it would be right in that context. But black and white would say it's always wrong or it's always right. Now, I personally have never had a one night stand, and I can't see a situation where I would, but I can understand why somebody, based upon his or her psychology, his or her life situation, his or her values, would want to do that, and it would be a rational thing.
All right, and I think a lot of that, because I know for myself, there are certain things that I believed as a kid, and growing up, and the ideas that I had back in my teens, that certainly aren't the views that I have now. They've evolved as I've evolved as a person. You certainly can't grow and become who you want to be if you're stuck in a set of rigid ideals.
Certainly, and that has to do with a lot of what you asked about what my message is. If you're going to enjoy your life, if you're going to be true to your own self, it has to be a constant process of self-improvement. I look at myself now, and I look at myself 10 years ago, and then I look at myself when I was in middle school. I don't even think I'm the same person I was in middle school. I mean, I obviously am in the sense that I have the same identity, the same biology, all that sorts of things. But I think if you looked at who I was in middle school, you would not even recognize the person I am now if you hadn't seen the change. And if I didn't know the process I went through, I would have been shocked at who I've become. So I do think it's a major thing, exactly what you're saying. It's all about self-improvement, right? I mean, House, that whole show is about self-improvement. That's why it might be my favorite show ever. So yeah, if you're going to be true to yourself, if you're going to love yourself, you're going to be the best version of yourself. That means realizing you're limited. Your knowledge is limited. So there's always more to learn, and you can always get better. And, if you're going to improve, that means there's a possibility you were wrong, and you have to recognize that possibility.
What do you think your biggest improvement has been?
Just as a writer or a person? Because those are two very different things.
Both.
I think as a person, I've improved the most by recognizing what I've been through in the past and realizing my psychological weaknesses. And I think the biggest one is realizing where I'm plagued by a lot of doubt often, and I feel very alone often. And I think it comes from recognizing, my uniqueness in the sense that I wasn't surrounded by a lot of people similar to me growing up. And that made it very difficult for me to connect with people. So being able to recognize that and tell myself that and reinforce that, okay, that feeling you're feeling is a result of the past, not a result of the present, has helped me be more comfortable in myself. I think my biggest improvement writing wise is the word integration, as I was saying earlier. When I was younger, I really did sort of accept tacitly the idea that I couldn't know completely what I was doing. And I wasn't writing things that were necessarily interesting to me. I was just saying, oh, well, I'm going to write this because that's what the assignment is, or I'm going to write this because that's the way it should be written. But now I take control of what I write a lot more. And I think I know, based upon improving myself, what I find interesting in a story. So I try to put that in my stories a lot more.
You go back to your earlier work and look at it and just say, oh, God, what the hell was I thinking?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I have so much stuff saved from undergrad and even from before that I was writing. And I think the best way to put it is I wrote too much about concretely what was going on around me, where I would say, like I said, I've always been observational, and I read it and it's just, there's nothing that takes it to an artistic level. It's just sort of like, here's something that happened, and I'm going to vaguely create a character that is not the same as that, but is obviously just recounting that event from this quote-unquote fictional perspective. Whereas now I can look at, what are the ideas motivating that? Why did that happen? And take that why and craft a story that's more exciting about it. Why do a zombie story? because it's much more interesting to discuss the themes of the story in a situation where people are fighting zombies than it is to, deal with that with, just people interacting in school or people interacting in a society. So that actually, your question of do I see my old writing and just think of how bad it is, actually helps answer your earlier question of how have I improved. But yeah, definitely I look at it and it's just, I don't want it to ever see the light of day. And why did I ever think I could be a writer at that point?
Well, I'd like to say I had all of these questions planned out in a specific order, but the fact of the matter is I just wing it as I go along.
Well, that speaks to your ability as a podcast host. So,
much like my writing, I just tend to wing it as I go along because I'm fairly lazy when it comes to outlining. One thing I wanted to ask is when you were on the Supernauts, afterwards in some of the comments, there was a lot of criticism of you that I didn't think was particularly warranted, and I wanted to know how do you deal with that?
Well, that's another thing that's been a big improvement in my life. I recently just put like all of my social media on lockdown, and I decided that my social media is going to be used for promotion and talking to a specific few friends. The people who are really close to me and really valuable to me. Daniel and Elliot on the podcast. My girlfriend, I talked to her on there. There are a few other people I talk to on there. Nobody else can see that I'm online anymore. And I only post things to promote what I've written or the podcast or stuff from the web series. And that's a more recent development because you're exactly right. It's been very, very tough for me for a very long time. You asked how I improved in life. That was one of the things, is recognizing that those feelings of solitude, of being alone, aren't real. I'm not really living life on my own. That just comes from feeling that way growing up because I wasn't really around people who were similar to me. Because unfortunately, I was growing up during sort of the time when the internet first became big for our society. I was on AOL in the 90s when it was still dial-up and you got kicked offline if you didn't have the star whatever on because somebody picked up the phone. And that happened because at one point my dad didn't know how to I don't know, I don't want to say he didn't know how to deal with me, but he didn't know how to reach me in the sense that I was big into Star Trek Deep Space Nine back then and I watched Next Generation a little bit. And there weren't that many people around me who were into it. I went to a very small school. There were 60 kids in my graduating class, 500 kids K through 12. Nobody in my family was really into it. So he told me, look at all these people who talk about Star Trek in the AOL Star Trek group who, they have normal jobs and everything, but this is where they talk about Star Trek. And I sort of took to the internet for far too long in my life, believing that was a place for me to express myself versus reality. And without realizing it, it was sort of like this disjointed side of myself where in reality I thought I was someone different than, or I didn't think I was supposed to express myself. In reality is a better way to say it. I didn't think I was someone different. It's just, I didn't think I was supposed to express myself. So yeah, I would take those opinions very seriously because to me, the internet was never about anonymity. It was always about this is your chance to say something that you can't say otherwise. But then there are a lot of people on there who use it anonymously. And the way I've learned to adapt is I just don't take it seriously. Like somebody on Pulp Epic today posted a video and all they said was, this is what I predict is going to happen with the show. And it was a video of a bomb sound effect. I don't take comments like that seriously because one, it comes from a name that isn't connected to any real name. The avatar is not a real avatar. And it's a name and an avatar that's continually spewed hate. And I just have to recognize that even though it does bother me that was said, and it does sort of upset me, and I was thinking about that before the podcast actually, I just recognize that person has something else going on. There's a reason they're acting like that way. I don't think it's a healthy way of acting. And like you said, ultimately this goes back to me learning to trust in myself and love myself and say, I trust my mind because I go over the top sometimes because I find that entertaining. If you listen to my podcast, I say ridiculous things because I think the ridiculous is amusing. Witness the farce. I think the farcical is amusing. But it's obvious when I'm doing that. And like you said, if I think what I think is right, and I think that I'm not saying anything that deserves this sort of negativity and hatred, then if people are giving me that sort of negativity and hatred, my only conclusion can be that I can't take what they're saying seriously because I don't think that that was an earned response.
That's a very good point. And I could go on about this forever, Justin. I enjoy talking to you, but I know you have another podcast to get to. So we'll end this here, and I want to thank you for coming on. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me. Everybody, if you get a chance, check out howtozombie.com or check us out on YouTube, How to Survive the Zombie Apocalypse. We've got a teaser up there for the first episode. The first episode is going to be released January 12th. It'll be on YouTube. It'll also be on Pulp Epic. I don't know if that's a dirty word to say on this podcast on the Supernauts, but yeah, that's where it's going to be released. You can also check out our podcast. That's what I'm going to be recording here real soon. Welcome to the Midside. We really try to look at things on sort of an in-depth level and point out there is a different voice out there. And there are people who see things differently. I mean, that's why we decided to do the Snyder series, where we talk about Zack Snyder, because there are people out there who love Zack Snyder. That's why his movies make a lot of money. So we're saying it's okay to like Zack Snyder. We do too. This is why. And we're not doing it to tear anyone down. We're doing it to express ourselves and show love for what we show love for. So, check us out if you want to see a different opinion. Realize that I'm not trying to threaten you. I'm not trying to tell you to tell you to not do what you want to do. Do your thing if you believe it's true. But, give us a chance. Check us out. See what we're all about. See what I'm all about. See what How to Survive the Zombie Apocalypse is all about.
And you can see all about him on the website. We'll post the links to the YouTube channel, to the Midside website, and to the podcast. And so you can check everything out to your heart's content. And if you like Imaginarium, check out our shows that we have on the network. And there's something for everyone, and all are guaranteed to entertain. And until next time, may all your journeys be filled with pure imagination.